All right, so we have Kathy Kleinbaum, the Deputy City Manager of the City of San Mateo, to explain their process.
Hi, sorry for the delay. I found a big typo on my slide. I wanted to make sure I fixed it. Thank you so much for having me here today. Our process started a while ago. So when we first started our process, it was before any of these talks of, the CEC was talking about having a solar ordinance as a model. So we were really kind of on our own at the time. We adopted our climate action plan in April 2015. And in the climate action plan, there was a lot of different policies that were looked at, including a solar ready policy, which we had no idea at the time would actually be mandatory in the new building code. We did look at some mandatory solar policies, which were pretty aggressive. At the time, I think we looked at 50% of all energy use being produced by solar. And I should back up by saying that San Mateo is a very different city than Fremont. Most of our new construction at this point is very high density multifamily. I think we build like 3 or 4 new single family homes a year at max. So when we're looking at our policies, we're building a lot of high density commercial, a lot of high density multifamily. So those kind of policies of 50% of energy reduction are very aggressive. So at the time, our city council was a little bit uncomfortable even with having that as a suggested policy. Our council is very, very progressive, but they didn't want anything on paper that they weren't necessarily, they didn't believe was feasible to adopt. So they adopted the solar ready and EV ready policies in the CAP, but told staff, we want you to come back and we want you to look at more, but let's look at it before we adopt it as a possible policy. And mind you, in a CAP, it's just really a suggested measure. It's not an actual policy, but they didn't want to put anything like in writing in a plan that they weren't sure that they could actually go forward and do. So they did give us direction to go back and look at more. And so we hired a green building consultant, Melanie Jacobson, who works for Integrated Design 360, because none of us really had any idea of how to do a code adoption process for this type of REACH code. And she was really amazing and really walked us through the process from start to finish. And through her, we also hired TRC consultants for our cost effectiveness analysis. We did involve a lot of stakeholders in our process. It was a very iterative process. We have the City's Sustainability Commission. We also worked closely with the development community to make sure that they were comfortable with the policies. It took us over a year to study this, and we spent about $100,000 on the process. And we were able to get it done in time to go into effect with the new building code. And unfortunately, it only lasts for 3 years, so we'll have to look at something again for the next building code. So our main goals for this whole process was, first of all, to be consistent with our climate action plan, but also to make sure that we had requirements that were really straightforward and easy to understand. We wanted to be progressive, but we also didn't want to impact development in our community. We're really proud of the development that goes on in our community, and we think it's part of the larger sustainable strategy for more transit-oriented development. We want to not put a damper on any of the construction that we are already seeing happen. So as has been discussed, you really need to make sure that whatever you approve is cost effective. And there had already been a study that BayREN had commissioned, I think based off the 2013 building code, that showed in our climate zone 3, that the typical tiers, the tier 1 and tier 2, are just not cost effective, at least based on that 2013 measure, because we're just a super mild climate. No one has air conditioning, or very few people have air conditioning. I guess that's changing these days. We also did a lot of research on other cities that had codes, although at the time there was a lot fewer cities that had codes. And we really tried to look at something that was simple. I will say that the city of Lancaster in Southern California became our #1 model. And we just really liked their approach of just having a minimum size system with the concept that people will figure it out themselves. You make them put solar on, people will put the right size panels on that work for their projects. And we also spent a long time debating our electric vehicle policies, whether we wanted to mandate installation or just readiness. And I'll get into that later. So we kind of did it a little bit backwards. Like, we didn't start with a specific policy in mind. We actually did our cost effectiveness analysis kind of based on a broad universe of possible policies just to see what would be cost effective. And in our particular climate zone, very little was cost effective that was easy to understand. Not that there was nothing that was cost effective, but there were a lot of like really advanced lighting control measures that I don't even fully understand what they were. And I'm like, if I can't understand them, how am I supposed to explain to council, and how are we supposed to explain to developers? So, you know, we looked at a lot, and then we ended up sort of coming back to the very basic measures, such as mandatory solar, cool roofs, and EV charging. Throughout this whole process, we also went to our Sustainability Commission and asked them for ideas of measures they want us to study. We had extensive debates about on-demand hot water systems, which ultimately we decided not moving forward with. We also, during our stakeholder meetings with our development community, we wanted to make sure that they were really comfortable with what we were proposing. And, you know, when it came to the solar policies, they were really concerned that it doesn't work for every building type, especially multifamily. And so they thought that solar thermal was a lot better option for multifamily. So when we said that we would make that an alternative choice, they were very comfortable with the policy. They had a lot of concerns about EV readiness policies, and I'm not sure I fully understand, but a lot of the concerns related to sizing the electrical capacity at the time of development, and if you oversize it, there was some discussion about whether PG&E would make you resize it at a later date, or whether you were paying for much more electrical infrastructure than you ever might need. So that was a big debate that took a delay in the process for at least the EV portion. So in the end, you know, our REACH codes ended up affecting both the energy code and the green building code, and so we ended up doing those sort of as two separate adoptions. The energy code measures included mandatory solar installations and cool roofs. The solar installation, again, was based on a very minimum size system. So you saw those slides earlier of the ranges that they're recommending in the model solar ordinance, and ours are a lot smaller. So for a single family system, it's a 1 kilowatt system, and most single families do at least 2 to 3 kilowatts. For multifamilies, we have different sizes based on the size of the building, but a minimum of 3 kilowatt for a large multifamily building, and also the alternative for a solar hot water. And again, this was based on the concept that people will, it's not cost effective to put in a super tiny solar system, that people will figure it out themselves what is cost effective for them. If they have to do solar, then they will work with a proper consultant, and they will figure out the size that makes sense. And if they have other needs on their roof, for like a roof garden or for other infrastructure, then being too prescriptive won't get in the way of those other needs. It's per building. So again, these are very small systems. So we're just making sure their foot is in the door. For non-residential, we started at a slightly higher threshold, with a small commercial building being a 3 kilowatt system and anything larger being a minimum 5 kilowatt, and again with the alternative for a solar hot water system if it makes sense. So we did the cost effectiveness analysis. The system sizes that we recommended were very cost effective for residential. They still met the criteria for commercial, but it wasn't quite as extreme cost effectiveness. It was 1.8, 1.7, where the threshold is 1. We then looked at cool roofs, which was also one of the measures that was in our climate action plan. And also, it was in the climate action plan, and when the building code amendments came out, it was already one of the requirements that was in the building code amendments. But we looked at cooler roofs, although it's sort of funny to name your requirement that. So it's just a higher level of reflectivity than was already required by the code. And we ended up finding out, at least in our climate zone, that for whatever reason, the single family residential wasn't cost effective. And that wasn't a big concern for us, again, because we build like 3 a year of new single family, so we were fine excluding those. So the cost effectiveness for cool roofs was kind of funny, because sometimes for cool roofs, it's, lack of color. And so for some roofs, it's cheaper to not put color in. So it's cheaper just to begin with. But for whatever reason, for non-residential, I guess based on what's already typical, the cost effectiveness was kind of just barely eked by, but for multifamily, it was huge. 10.6 is a tremendous ratio. So the electric vehicle policy issues, like I mentioned, were a lot more challenging for us. We looked at both readiness and mandatory installs, and there was a lot of pushback from our development community about the cost of these and whether there would really be adequate demand. Even though the costs for the EV readiness was estimated only at about 4,000 per space, but the actual electrical capacity that's required takes up physical space in a building, so I think that was one of the concerns that a lot of developers had. We ended up moving forward with it. We decided to drop the mandatory requirement for actual installation and just go with an EV readiness requirement. So for commercial multifamily, we went with 10% of total parking spaces. For multifamily, the building code actually requires 3%, the state building code, and for commercial it's at 6%. So we exceeded those existing percentages, but not by a lot. And then as sort of an add-on measure, because we really wanted to do something related to water conservation, we mandated laundry to landscape conversions for our single-family homes, new single-family homes. And these is just the valve that gets people the first step of the way. It cost like $100, but it was sort of a token step that we could do to encourage water conservation. So we had a pretty extensive process with our Sustainability Commission where they reviewed all our recommendations, and then it went to the City Council for approval. For the Energy Code, it had to be reviewed by the CEC, and they had their 60-day public comment period. We were told, and luckily it didn't happen, but if the CEC had any recommended changes to the ordinance, we'd actually have to go back to council and re-adopt the changed ordinance. So thankfully we didn't need to do that, but it did get approved by the CEC as it was. And then all these approvals are really only relevant to the current building code cycle. So again, for the next building code cycle, anything that we look at we'll have to redo. So these passed unanimously. We had no issues or concerns and went into effect in January. Our building department has created handouts that have all our local code amendments. We have some additional ones that relate to fire sprinklers, and I think every jurisdiction does their own local codes. So they've included it in their standard handouts. We also have a special web page that outlines these requirements. And I checked in with our building official, and to date there haven't been any stated concerns or issues with compliance. I'm not sure how much has actually been built under this new building code. A lot of our projects that are under construction now were approved under the prior building code, but to date, from what I've heard, everything's been going pretty smoothly. And that's it.